thank you to our sponsors. I'm excited to have this event running again, so hopefully we continue this in future years. Portland next year, that's what I hear. Okay. This is managing configuration across environments and sites with configuration split. I'm Andrew Wilson. I am a web developer here at the University of Washington in the College of Arts and Sciences. We have a shared, it's a Drupal multi-site, it's a shared hosting service for departments. We have 33 of our 40 academic departments in the college on our service. And it's pretty standardized, so we have a consistent configuration for all those sites. Every site is, of course, not exactly the same. There's differences that you would expect, like the site name obviously needs to be different. But then every department, has their own special needs. We're all of us snowflakes, so we have to account for that. And in sort of dealing with that, all the configuration for all those sites, I was hoping to make differences visible, which is one of the big pain points bringing those sites off of Drupal 7. They were mostly consistent, but what were the differences between them? Who has what, little thing turned on? It's all in the database somewhere, but it's hard to tell. So in Drupal 8, 9, 10, I wanted to use the configuration sync system to make those differences visible, which meant avoiding 33 separate config sync directories. So that's what I was hoping to do. We're here to talk about configuration split. Who here has used configuration split? Okay. Most of us configuration sync system? Yeah? Okay. So config split uses this is our agenda, sorry. We're going to talk about what configuration split does, configuring it to help us set up our development environments consistently, how that works, and then we'll look at using it to share configuration between sites, and then some sort of best practices or tips that I've come up with over the past couple of years of using this system. I now have 26 of my 33 sites off of Drupal 7 and in Drupal 10. So I'm almost there. So close. So configuration split uses the configuration synchronization system. Config sync is a core Drupal feature. It's sort of the configuration for your sites is config sync considers that active configuration, so that's in the database, and that's what your sites are actually running on. So we have our usual settings like an hour of cache, time to live. What happens without config split, so the regular config sync system, it lets you export that configuration out of the database into what they call staged configuration. Staged configuration is a set of YAML files. If you have ever used the drush config get command and you haven't told it what to get, it shows you a list of hundreds of configuration objects. Each of those configuration objects, when it's exported to stage configuration, gets a YAML file. A YAML file is a text file. It's structured. And so for our cache TTL, our max age, it looks like this. There's a cache key inside that. There's other keys as well inside that, but one of them is page, and one of those is max age. So that's exported as seconds, so it's 3,600 seconds for an hour. If we make a change in our active configuration in the UI, or using config set with drush, we export that again. Our YAML files get updated, so we can track that change. The important thing about having these in YAML files is those are files on the file system. We can commit those to Git, so we can push them around, deploy them, track changes. We know what we've done. In Drupal 7, it's all in the database, and unless you figure something out, which we hadn't, if you make a change, well, the old changes, the old setting's gone. So, I hope it was backed up because it's totally gone. So having it in the staged configuration and in Git is safer. You can also take changes that are in the stage configuration. Say you've made a change in a local development environment, you've committed that to Git, you push that up to your production server, you can then import it, and the active configuration gets set from those YAML files. So that's, again, configuration synchronization. That's the core Drupal system that config split sort of intervenes in and works with. With configuration split, with that module active and the splits set up, because it's what happens is configurable, of course, you can, configuration splits sits in between the active configuration that your site is running on and those exported YAML files. So it sort of assumes that you have your main configuration, the unsplit, I guess, configuration exported already. And then you can make changes that you want to see in active configuration. You have configuration split set up to split certain config objects. And as then that configuration is exported out of active configuration to the staged configuration, to the YAML files, config split pulls out the changes between active configuration and staged configuration, and it saves those in a separate place. It can save the entire configuration object or just parts of it, depending on how you set it up. So you'll have your main configuration saved, and then split saved somewhere else. And you can turn those splits on in certain contexts, certain environments. So as we'll see shortly, you can have settings for just development that are only present in development. So those settings will never get close to your production environment. When you import from import configuration, and it pulls one of these splits, it takes the main configuration and merges the changes that are in those splits back into the configuration before it gets set in the active configuration on your site. Let's see. So how do we do this? First, we need to know how to work with configuration sync. You can, the directory that all these files end up in is, by default, it goes into like the files directory, into a randomly named directory, but it's better to set it in your settings.php file. Outside of your web root, there can be some sensitive information in those configuration files in the YAML files sometimes, so it's best to set that outside of your web root. Once you've done that, you can use the user interface at admin configuration development configuration synchronization, and that's the development section that's down here, configuration synchronization. You can also use drush on the command line, config export, import. The diff flag gives you sort of will show you more granularly the changes that are going to happen. Configuration status will show you some of the same stuff that we'll see on the UI page. There's also a couple config split specific commands that could be useful. I'm not going to talk about them too much, but you should know they're there. Config split export and config split import. So let's look at this synchronized page. Hold on. Yeah. Right now it says that the staged configuration is identical to the active configuration. So we've already exported everything to our YAML files, and we can take a look over here. I'm in config for this site. It's in config. There's a ton of stuff, right? Lots of files. That's great. If we make a change to our configuration, come on. Like we were looking at the performance cache setting. If we change that to no caching, save it, then we'll see that reflected here. It says system performance, which is where that setting lives, the configuration object that setting lives. It's changed. We can view the differences, and it tells us now it's inactive. On the site, it's set to 0. In staged, in the YAML files, it's set to 3600 an hour. If we export that, CEX is the shorthand for config export. That will also tell us what changes. Oh, it's set up differently. What? Oh, I have some command line stuff set to help me manage all the different sites, and it's set to the wrong one.
Another Lando user.
Yeah, Lando still. It's I just haven't gotten around to changing. I know everyone else has changed.
I know, I'm the same boat.
So, yeah, I set it up 5 years ago, and it was work, and I have to redo that work if I want to change it. So I don't want to change it. So it tells us the system performance has changed. If we export that, it's going to update that configuration object or that configuration that exported. YAML files. We tell it to go ahead and do that. Get status shows that file has changed, and if we look at the difference, the max age has changed. So that's configuration export. That's what we're working with. I'm going to set that back to an hour. And export again, and my little status should go green there. So everything's fine. Okay. That's a little bit of working with configuration synchronization. So working with config split, we're going to create a development split. So settings that are active only in our development environment. You can set that stuff up every time you start a new development if you would like. But this makes it consistent for every time we open up a development environment. It's the same for me. It's the same for my colleagues. So there's no confusion there. You want to work in a development environment with a fresh copy database from production and configuration exported. So you know that when you start messing with things and exporting configuration, you only get these new development changes that you've made. First thing you need to do is enable the config split module. I already have it enabled. Config split is active on every environment, including production, but then that's the only configuration change in production. Otherwise, production just has the standard config that you've exported. First thing you want to do is create a new split. We will configuration split lives in configuration development, just above configuration sync, config split. So we have no splits. We're going to create a new one, development. They're active by default, which means that changes that we export that we've configured it to notice will be exported and to the split export, the split staged files. Otherwise, if it was inactive when we made a change, that configuration that we've changed would go into the main exported file. So we'll leave that active for now. We'll just go ahead and save this. No, wait, I was going to storage. We're not going to worry about it too much. I'm just going to set it to collection, which doesn't actually work for me on my multi-site, but we'll get there. We'll export that. We've created a new configuration object by creating that config split. So here we see it's config split module. We've created a config split and we called it development. So that's our change. We're going to look at that. This is what our config split looks like when we've exported it. There's nothing there really yet. The things we're going to look at are this module, complete, and partial splits. So we'll see those change as we start to do things. So after you've created your split, you want to make the configuration changes that you want to see. What I'm going to do is, this error we've been seeing, my single sign-on setup uses simple SAML PHP. It doesn't work in a development environment. I don't want to just turn off the module because there are blocks and stuff that it sets up, and I don't want it to mess with the blocks. I just don't want to see this error all the time. That setting is, I can change that. And this is, you will change what works for you. This is just the thing that I'm changing to show. So This activate authentication, this is going to turn it off. It'll still be present, but it'll turn it off. So I'm going to stop seeing that error. We will stop seeing that error. Okay, so no more error. That's great. If we look at configuration status now, something's different. The simple sample auth settings are different, which is good. That's right. That's what we expect. If we export configuration, it'll change that file in the file system. Ooh. What's going on here?
You're supposed to put a folder for it, or
For this,
For
each
each
environment or whatever.
Well, it will. The storage setting that we selected over here, it does that all by itself. So when you select collection, it will export. You see,
Questions?
oh, it's not there because we haven't actually added anything yet. So 1 second. So we changed simple sample auth. It's modified our main configuration, which is not what we want. But we know that simple sample auth dot settings is what is changing. So we need to tell config split that we want it to split out changes to simple sample auth settings. So we'll go ahead and do that. There's a big list. Again, these are your hundreds of configuration objects in your system. But exporting and seeing what changes, if you don't know where your changes, what configuration object or changes is going to be in, this is how you would know. You export it and you see what changes. Or the configuration status will tell you. So I'll check simple sample auth settings and save that. And then, I should add git config. Add our config split, the actual split definition of the split itself. I'm going to commit that. Okay. I don't want to modify my main configuration, so I'll revert that and export again. So now we should see split changes. So we've modified our config split. We've added a new configuration object to split. But we see it's deleted our main simple sample auth settings and it's put that in this split development collection. That's not what we want either, because we want those simple sample auth settings on production. We don't want those just in development. So there are two ways to split in config split. There's complete split, which is what we used before, and there's partial split, which only tracks changing keys. The complete split takes the entire config object out of the main config and puts it in the split config. So that's not what we want in this case. We'll want that here in a second. So uncheck simple sample auth settings there. We'll check it down here. And then we'll export again. Then what we see is what we want. The config split, development split, is changed. But then it's added, this is no longer just the simple sample auth settings, it's config split patch simple sample auth settings. Okay? That, the patch files that config split, I still don't know what's going on here. It's confusing. The patch files it creates are diffs, essentially. So this is our, up on the top of the terminal here. This is a diff sort of in YAML of the active config and the exported config, the config that was already exported that's active on my production environment. You see it removes the activate key, which had a true setting, and it adds a new activate key with a false value. So that's what's going to happen on our development system, so that I no longer get that here.
So just, right.
Yep.
Yeah, just to confirm what you're saying. The complete split takes an entire config object And the partial just takes an individual key value per.
Yeah, the complete split, it removes that configuration object from the main config sync directory. So the next time you import configuration from that config sync directory, when the split is not active, it won't have that configuration at all.
Okay.
The partial split just records differences. So it leaves the exported configuration object in the main config sync directory. And as configuration is exported and imported, it sort of intervenes and it checks to see if anything's different between active configuration on the site and the exported YAML in the configuration sync directory. Whatever's different, it will note down what's been removed, what's added, and that's what goes in the patch file. Yep.
Maybe this might be an appropriate time for my question, which is, how would you make the decision to do a partial config split compared with just an override in settings.php? Like
You can configuration can be set in settings.php, and we're going to do that here in a second.
Okay.
To turn on one of our splits, but I end up with a lot of stuff in these splits, and it would be onerous to put it all in the settings.php.
Easier maintenance.
Yeah, so yeah, absolutely.
Well, if you make a split, could you reuse it like across a couple development environments then?
Yeah, you can. Yeah, splits, you can turn them on, when you want them, and it's best to automate that, which we'll look at, so that you don't have to do it over and over. But I mean, sometimes you do want to just like turn something on, use a view or a report or something, and then you can turn it back off. But
So you're just adding like a switch case to the settings file or something?
yeah, yep. Let's see. I'm gonna commit our simple SAML. That's fine. That's good enough. Okay. One other thing in the config split settings, we set a complete split of the configuration object. Then we change it to a partial split. You can mark that entire modules should be part of this split. This is a development environment, so I'm going to go ahead and activate the devel module, which you do not want active in your production environments. So I've done that, and then I will add it to this split, and it does some extra funny things, and we'll see that here. Devel, split that. We only want that active in development. So save that, and I'm going to export that. Config split is doing more than just noting that that module has been split. If we look up at the split again, the module now has devel set. So the devel module will only be activated when this split is active. This is the partial split we had before. But there's also a number of other settings configuration objects that have been exported along with that. Config split does some dependency checking on complete splits. And if a configuration object depends on something you have split completely, config split will also split that depending object. So we have not only the main module, which appears in the split definition itself, but devel settings, devel toolbar settings, and the menu. And it does that automatically. Sometimes that can trip you up a little bit. Sometimes. Let's see. Let's add that to commit to get. Very clear. Okay. I think I've done all this. Yep. Export configuration. Okay. There are a few things to consider. So that's like our main development split. Okay. I've set a setting that I want to see in development. I've activated a module I want active only in development. That's the process. You make the change in development, you add it to the split, you export that. You need to think about when you want this split to be active. We left our split active. You normally want to leave them inactive if it's not going to be active in production. That can change. So this active checkbox, we don't want that actually. So that will make it active anywhere it's defined. Any site that has it will activate it. We don't want that. We want to leave it off and only activate it when we're in a development environment. There are a couple ways to do that. You can use the status override dropdown that will activate the split and record that change in state, which state is for ephemeral information, like the last time cron was run. And state lives in the database and it's not configuration, so it doesn't get exported. So if we set this here and then send our configuration files up to production, this will not be active. But if we pull a backup from production to do some work, it's going to overwrite this, which is not super convenient either. You can add drush commands to your workflow scripts that, like, if you have them that pull those databases to activate it here. But we're going to do something else. Right up here under active, it suggests that you can use settings.php to change the status of this split. First, I guess, let me activate this. Our main configuration split screen, it shows that we have default status now is inactive, but its current status is active because of state. So that's the override. So we're not gonna keep that. The better thing to do is to activate in settings.php. You want to activate it only in certain conditions, which we heard before. Where is it? This one's the default site. So in settings.local, which I, during my dev setup scripts, put local settings file that Lando accesses to get database access. We can uncomment this line. Config split. Config split. We're activating config split. Development, the machine name of the config split we want to activate. Set its status to true. So we're changing the configuration of this configuration object, which is what Rick mentioned earlier. You can do that with anything. You could do that to change, not use config split and change your whole setup in settings.php with that. I mean, that gets really complicated. So here we're just changing this splits status to true. So if we save that and then we're going to refresh the page in the UI, instead of it's back to inactive, now it'll be active again, and it says it's active because of settings.php, which is what we want. Because now if we pull down a database backup from production, the settings.php takes care of turning on the split for us. We don't have to remember to do that. I know that if it's me, I would go crazy trying to figure out why is this thing I'm working on in development not working. It's because I never turned on the split. So now I don't have to think about that. Question?
That status override thing.
Yeah.
That seems like it'd be useful when I want to change like my stage environment configuration. I'm in local. I just want to change that temporarily. Is that what that's for?
Yeah, you could use it that way. Yeah, to work in.
As soon as you import config again, it goes
Yeah,
back. I do that in my settings file, and it's a pain in the butt.
Yeah, it depends because it depends on how your split is normally activated. This is a little bit in the weeds, but the status set in settings.php, that's going to override anything else.
Oh, okay. It won't work.
So yeah, so maybe that wouldn't work for you. So if you try to, like, I think so we have this active in because of settings.php. If we try to override it and set it inactive in state, I don't think this is going to work. I think it stays active. Yeah. So the settings.php is the final word if it's set there. Okay. So override. one of the other settings that we sort of breezed past is this storage setting. The collection, as we saw, it adds files inside the main configuration directory, sync directory for this site is config DWF. You see that it's been adding them to a split directory inside of there, and then the name of the split, machine name of the split, and then all the configuration changes there. That's what collection does. That's convenient because it keeps it all in one place. They're in the config, in the main config sync screen. This screen reflects changes. I'm confused. I don't want to figure out what that means. This screen will show you changes that happen because of splits that are in collection, which is convenient. There are import-export tabs up here, so you can import and export your configuration in the UI. I find it very clunky. You then have to manage those files manually rather than it being exported right to your config sync directory. For instance, if you export your configuration, all of your configuration from the UI, you get a tarball, which, what are you going to do with that? I mean, you put it somewhere, but having it go straight into Git is better. The collection storage will work with all of this, which is nice. But in my multi-site situation, it doesn't work because what happens is if multiple sites split the same configuration object, and it may be only if they completely split it, but I mean, that's bad enough for me. Then they sort of steal it from one another. So if two splits have a complete split of a particular block, and I export configuration to one of those config splits, it'll disappear from the other one. So that doesn't work for me. What I use is folder. You choose folder. You have to define the actual directory where this is going to end up. I put it all in. There's a split directory inside config too. That's where I put them all. So it's separate from the main configuration. I don't think it works if you try and put it under your regular config sync directory. It needs to be somewhere else. So that works for me in my multi-site setup. It's a little more complicated because the UI import, export, and status that we looked at, that doesn't work for splits anymore if you use the folder storage, which is a little confusing. I mentioned the drush config export, the diff flag on the command line. So it shows you the actual keys that are going to change. That won't work for configuration that's in a split if the configuration is stored using that file storage. I don't think that's that big a deal because all those changes are going to end up in Git, and I can look at the diff in Git. If you're importing, you can also config import and use the diff flag there, and that does work. So when you're importing changes, importing configuration from a split, it gets merged into the final configuration before that configuration gets saved, and before this diff flag creates its output. So with the file storage, the diff flag doesn't work on export, but it does still work on import, and that's good enough for me because I can look at the diffs for exporting Git. Database storage stores it in a separate database table, which, I mean, is ephemeral. It kind of feels to me like it defeats the purpose. But if you want to have something there, you're not going to be able to share it. If you have a feature you turn on every once in a while for something, maybe that would work for you. I've never used the database storage. Yeah?
I have one use that I found for using database, and that is if you're also using config ignore.
Uh-huh.
Because config ignore will still export even though it won't import. So what you want is it not to export to any sort of directory, because then you've got to deal with that. So if you set database as the storage location, then it won't export also.
What is it exporting? It'll config ignore will export the configuration but not import it.
Right.
Except I think in the latest release they fixed that.
Oh, they
Yeah.
changed it. Oh.
Yeah, they fixed that. And in fact, yeah, you can get very granular now with config ignore and tell it to export certain things, only export them, to only import them, to export like a wild card, but then ignore this one thing. Yeah, anyway.
Outdated information.
Other options in for configuration split are weight and stackability. You can have multiple splits that are all making changes to your final configuration. I'm going to skip past that. I'm not going to talk about that anymore. As you're working with these, I've talked about pulling down a fresh database from production a couple times. If you do that and production has fresh config changes, which, I mean, ideally, the ideal workflow does not involve changing configuration on production, I guess, but I do it. I'm sure a lot of people do it. Sometimes editors can change certain things that may be your configuration, so you need to record those. If you pull that down from production and export it, since your development split is active, but the database you have doesn't have that development configuration set, when you export the exported development configuration will be wiped out, which is annoying. The solution for that is to use config split import and then your development split before exporting configuration. So if you try to import configuration with this fresh production database, but on your development environment, it would get rid of all of the configuration changes that you had that came down from production. If you import just the development split, it's going to just make the changes that split includes. So then your database in development will have whatever configuration changes had been made from production, but then also your development split configuration. Okay.
I think that might have saved me 4 hours in the last month.
Yeah. All right. So I use this again. So that was all dealing with just sort of an environment, a split for an environment, saving development settings. I use configuration split to share configuration across a multi-site of 33 sites. There are two ways you could try to do that. You could have each site having separate configuration sync directory, but then sharing some splits for like features or whatever. And I do that some, but my main strategy, that is for sites that are mostly different probably, but share some features. When you do that, you need to make sure your splits don't have any unmet dependencies, or they'll pull in things that you don't want to share. So if you do that, you have to be careful and watch when you export configuration, your split configuration, and see what is changing. Make sure you don't include anything you don't really, really want to share. I share all configuration. So I have one configuration sync directory. And then each site has its own split. And the split includes things like site names, but the splits include things like the site name, but also sometimes new fields on nodes, on bundles, or new content types entirely. So that's what we're going to look at now. All sites share the configuration sync directory. All sites, if they're going to use the same configuration sync directory, they need to have the same site UUID. Or when you try and import configuration, this is what you'll see. Drush will complain. That is in system.site. The key is UUID. You can update that with drush config set. It's easy, but practice, first on development before you do that. And then each site will have its own split. Storage we've talked about storage, so the collection doesn't play nice in my setup, so I use folder, and those splits contain tons of stuff. Every site has all the splits configured, but inactive, most of them inactive. They say, if you want to understand something, teach it. I was thinking about last night, I was like, this is really dumb. Why do I have to do that? I don't have to do this. You could actually set sites up to ignore any any split except their own, so they won't import any split. I just realized that last night. So I'm going to make that change eventually. So this slide is already outdated, so don't feel bad, Rick. It happens to all of us. But each site activates its own split in settings.php. So I don't think about turning splits on and off. It happens on its own. Yeah. So let's have a look. Gonna look at the Department of Classics, because that's a good one. So this is Classics list of splits. It includes all the departments. I do have some like feature type splits, like that web form migration one up there. There's a development split for development settings, but then AES, the American Ethnic Studies Department, American Indian Studies Department, Applied Mathematics, Anthropology, Art, and so on and so on and so on and so on. Okay. So each site has its own split. They're all inactive, note, except for Classics, which is the one we're on. It's activated in settings.php. So we can look at that. Folder setting, folder storage, and has a certain amount of complete split stuff. Let me look at it over here. It's probably easier. Not here, in fact, but here. So it has a big list of complete split stuff. A bunch of blocks. Front page. Our front pages are a bunch of blocks, and every site is going to be different. Every department has different stuff. Sometimes like so they always have the big slideshow, but there are a few different styles, and so those blocks are different. Every site has its own front page blocks. Sometimes they have like filtered lists of staff and faculty and stuff. Those get set up differently. So there are a bunch of blocks that are split. They have a custom user role, so that's in here too. Some blocks get partially split, so it's a standard block, but maybe just one little thing needs to change. For their giving form, it's just a key, a fund code that they need to have that's their own department code. So ignore migrations. No. Web forms change a little bit. There's a few views that are different for every department. So the list can get very big. It just depends on that department's needs. Minimizing differences is very helpful, but you can't always do that entirely. System site is always going to be different. That's where the site name is stored. So every department has its own site name, obviously. That one's always there. So every site has its own split like this. There are some shared features which I also turn on in settings.php. The events, most of our sites don't have events in Drupal. They use an outside service called Trumba that the university gives us. Study abroad, not every department uses. All right. So that's my setup. Any questions about that? It gets complicated fast, yeah?
You mentioned you have a command or something to switch which site you're working on locally. Is that just setting an environment variable?
More or less, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's a separate thing I set up for myself. It's a Lando tooling command, which you can do at DDEV too, and it just makes it easier. I use instead of, I could type out Lando drush to use drush, but that's annoying, so I set up an alias in bash. That's what the LAD is that you can see, Latin, and then whatever the drush command is. So.
Were those git commands also aliases?
Some of them, yeah. COs, checkout,
Right.
DF. Is that standard or is it not standard? I mean, it's diff, yeah, but I don't know if you have to type out diff or not. I don't remember. Honestly, I've been using it for it's like 5 years now, so I don't remember. Yeah.
On our config split settings, we're normally not dealing with a whole bunch of sites in one split. So we have splits for local development stage,
Yeah.
And the normal sync directory. Do you do any of that in combination with your different site splits?
Yeah, I mean, I have a development split, but I don't have a separate one for staging.
Okay, so
That
like a lot of what we're doing in those pre-production settings are blocking the site from sending emails to real people.
Yeah, yeah.
Are you doing that in your settings.php to detect? environment, or-
Yeah, so we are, for our host, we use platform.sh, and their non-production environments don't have the email service active, so I don't worry about that. But that's where you do it.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah, we're working with Pantheon a lot, and they don't have a mail server on any of their environments, so you need to use SendGrid or something like
Yeah.
that, so it's important. that
Yeah,
you
sure,
don't have
yeah.
your-
Yeah, I mean, platform I think also uses SendGrid, or maybe they used to anyway. But they turn it off in development environments, in non-production environments by default. So
My problem with using like SendGrid or something was the API keys end up going into the repo as config.
Yeah.
So you have
you
to
need
work
to-
out something for that.
yeah, that's good for config ignore, which Rick mentioned, because then you ignore the sensitive configuration like that. It doesn't end up in your repo.
Yeah, and it depends on your host, but
Right.
like Pantheon has a somewhat hard to use secrets.
Yeah, I thought
Plug-in that you
most
can-
of it
Yeah.
before.
Yeah.
It was-
I miss .inf files.
Well, that's where-
Nobody seems to use .inf files anymore.
uh-huh.
It seems like they're coming back. I'm seeing a lot of new tooling around providing ENV and Symfony has a full class module around it as well that we're looking at.
All right.
I hope it fully comes back and
Yeah.
made it a lot easier.
Yeah, I mean, environment variables
Yeah.
linked with the env file.
Is this question time still going?
No, it's still going. Yeah, I know. I know. So,
I'm loaded and.
yeah, so now onto best practices or tips, sort of that I've gathered the past couple of years. First is to use a reference site that has no site-specific splits active. It lets you confirm consistent import and export of shared configuration, especially after you update a module. So you update a module, run any updates, database updates that need to happen, and changes to your standard configuration, then you know it's just standard configuration that's changed. If you try and do this on a site that has the site-specific split active, you update, run your database updates, configuration changes, and then you export it. How do you know if it's standard configuration that's changed or site-specific configuration that's changed? It could be either. It could be standard configuration that's in an object that's partially split, but now that what should be a standard configuration change is now in that site's own split. So use reference site with no splits. It makes it easier to work with. I can go into this reference site, flip on any like feature specific split, make it change, and then export it. And I know it's just standard config that's changed. It's not site-specific stuff that's changed. I don't keep a backup of this site anywhere. I just use drush site install from the existing config, and it pulls in the standard configuration in the main sync directory with no splits active, unless I've activated them in settings.php or something. Next tip, conduct frequent import-export cycles from production. So this is, earlier I mentioned using the config split import command if you've pulled a new database from production. If you have configuration changing on production, you want to make sure to do that frequently. Export from configuration from production frequently, and also import, so any changes you may have frequently. I mean, as long as the development cycle works, if you're making the progress you need to on the features, the configuration changes. Because the smaller bites you're taking of these configuration changes, the easier it is to see what's happening. So since I'm making changes across 33 sites, I don't want to have, this list of changes happening on one site and then something else on a different site. How do I know I haven't got something mixed up? I don't know. The fewer configuration changes you're making at once, the easier it is to see what's going on and the less likely you are to make mistakes. I suggest considering automation, some kind of report that tells you if something has changed. That, like Drush, configuration status, just something has changed and you need to export configuration from production. So that's some kind of pipeline to tell you. Consider ways to generalize or simplify complicated configuration changes. Views are complicated. If you find yourself wanting to add displays using config split, I would suggest maybe consider doing that. Put that in a separate view entirely. That's sort of a judgment call, because if you're trying to depend on the main view, the main display of a view, then you're duplicating that configuration if you have an entirely separate view. But if you split a display, add a display in a split, or remove one, I guess. But if you have a display in a split, those are complicated, and there's lots of configuration involved, and so those config patch files will be giant and very hard to read. And remember that one of my goals is to be able to see what's different on a site. So if I have an entire display mucking up a config patch file, what if there's some other little change somewhere else in the view in some other display? Am I going to see that? I don't know. There's way too much output, So consider using a separate view. This is a whole talk maybe all on its own. This ctools views module is part of ctools, and it has some options for views blocks. You can give yourself options to hide fields, configure filters, configure sorts, and also like the number of items displayed and stuff. And this is for views block displays. And what happens is you then mark which things you want to be able to use when you set up the block, when you create an instance of the block. So the filters is the one that really simplifies things a lot for me. I add some filters to a block view, and make them exposed. And so then when I create the block, place the block, I can choose what the filter values should be when I'm filtering on. So if it's a taxonomy, I have news, I want to place just alumni news. I don't create any kind of filter, or I don't say in the view itself that I want to filter on alumni news. I just say, I need a filter on this taxonomy, okay? And then I place the block and choose alumni news there. And that configuration of the actual filter value is saved in the block's configuration, not in the view's own configuration. And so what that means is that I can reuse that same view block any number of times for different, and display different things, filter it different ways. Because how the module works is then that exposed filter, if I set a value for it on the, when I place the block, that exposed filter doesn't have to appear to the end user. It's just in the block. So then I can sort of create a library of blocks that I can use to display different things, and I'm not creating a bunch of different views displays. So it keeps the views themselves simple. I'm not splitting views, which I try to avoid doing. I just then split those blocks completely usually. So so departments have their own set of blocks, which I guess I mentioned before. Any questions about that? I think this one's really important. You can have a block with that shows more fields than you need and then hides some of them, you know, in certain situations for depending on what your different sites need. Web form is a weird one. I don't have a solution for this, but the elements key in the exported or in the configuration, the elements key for web form is a giant string. It's in the format of YAML, but it's not exported as YAML. So if you change any elements and split them, you'll see in the config split patch file the entire elements key removed, and then the entire elements key added again, and something in there has changed. What is it? I mean, I don't know. But something in there has changed. Again, I don't have a solution for this. Just be aware of this one. Web form's complicated too. Next thing, avoid stacking partial splits on the same configuration object. So I briefly mentioned that you can stack splits and have multiple splits, add or change configuration before it gets saved into the active configuration. Partial splits, remember, change just individual keys. They'll record differences on keys. If you have two splits that have the same configuration object selected, because you're telling configuration split to look at changes in a particular configuration object, you can't get any more specific than that. So if two splits have the same object selected, one of those splits is going to get all the changes, whichever one comes first in the export order. So that can be confusing. Export doesn't work in that situation. If you want those two changes recorded in two separate splits, it doesn't work. You can set up splits, right? What changes should be in which splits isn't clear. There is a key. There's an issue to add this functionality to let you specify which specific key within a configuration object you want to be part of a split, but it hasn't seen much progress. I hope to work on it. Let's see, send that. You can set up simple, usually, config split patch files yourself so that they import correctly. But if you try and export them, then turn around and export them again. Your carefully crafted patch files will be mangled. This is just for if both splits are using partially split the same configuration object. If a lower weight split splits something that a higher weight split has completely split, that works okay because the completely split configuration gets added first, and then the split comes in, it changes something that was just added. So that works okay. It only doesn't work if it's two partial splits. Be careful of configuration that depends on content, which is not synchronized. So something like a block, a custom block, the placement of the block, that's configuration, but the content of the block is not configuration, which is confusing, but that's the way it works. So when you, this also works for views that filter on taxonomy terms. If you define those filter values in the view itself, the view's configuration, and those can get mangled because taxonomy terms can end up with different UUIDs or term IDs in different databases. So you have to be careful of that. Other modules can be used to share some content, like structure sync. When I start a new site, because I'm migrating them still, when I start setting up a new site, I use structure sync to import a standard set of taxonomy terms, and they'll get the same UUID and term ID. If you try and import configuration for which the content does not exist, you'll see errors from Drush. It'll tell you, UUID does not exist. It'll show you the UUID, which is gobbledygook. Yeah, the entity or UUID, because different things use different IDs, have to match for it to work. If you don't re-import that content, like the things that I've imported with structure sync, once they're imported, I can edit them because the UUID and ID is set. The content I never re-import, so I can change it. As long as the UID and ID are set in the database, the other configuration that uses that content will work. Any questions about that? That was a tough one. Okay. Be careful of reusing a field that's completely split on an entity bundle in a different split. If you define a split field in one split, its storage configuration is in that split. If you then use it in some other split, use the field instance definition then depends on the storage definition. So the field, because the config split dependency checking that I mentioned before, the field instance definition will depend on the storage definition, so the instance will end up in the other split, even if you're trying to split it into somewhere else. So that's it. I've got to the end. I hope this is useful for some of you. It's a hard gained experience. It can get really complicated really fast. So really trying to simplify your shared configuration or your split configuration, it can save you a lot of trouble.
Just the misunderstanding I had about complete versus partial split is going to save me a lot.
Yeah, that part.
It makes a huge difference. Yeah, and I think that was new in 2.0, I think. Before that, if you partially split something, it would still, the export of the YAML will still have the whole thing there.
It doesn't make patch.
Yeah, the patch file creation is new in 2.0, which is, I mean, it's over a year old, I think, but.
Do you ever run into like, I don't know if you have people on your team or whatever, but working on this config split.
Yeah.
But with different developers, I've had situations where like the key value pairs get exported in a different order. Is that maybe it's like the collation of their database or something? Like I don't know. Maybe
if when.
But it messes up like workflows, right? Like
it can. Yeah, that's kind of annoying.
You can't import it. Like it'll.
Sometimes
it's kind of buggy. Like
sometimes you'll try and import it, and it will import anything that like the keys that need to be there will be there, but they'll be in the wrong order, as you say, and so it won't match. Yeah. When config import, when config split imports and adds a key to an unordered list of values, or adds a value to an unordered list of values, it'll always add it at the end.
Gotcha.
So if then, like, when they're exporting, if whatever database they're using, if it tries to reorder things,
right.
To make it not at the end or something. Yeah, it's
supposed to have been fixed with a update of a few months ago.
Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe that's so maybe it was a known thing.
My sense of time is all messed up, so months might be 6 months to a year ago, or it might be less.
Well, just a few months ago, for the first time, I hit this one where it was like truthy, falsy values were suddenly actually trues or falses, where they used to be like ones or zeros.
Yeah, that's a change where they.
Is that a recent change?
Yeah,
Okay,
if it was empty, sometimes it could be empty, or it could be null, or it could be a quoted empty string, and they've unified that.
That was causing all kinds of havoc.
Yeah.
Well,
So that's why it's really important to do a config export right after you do any kind of, especially core update of your modules. Get that new configuration out at the same time.
Do it right away. Well, we could probably wrap up this all day. Thanks, man. That was awesome.